car that brought her was not like the other cars. It was a simple, faded blue sedan that had been borrowed from the orphanage's administrator for the evening. When it pulled up to the house, or rather, to the long, winding drive that led to the house, it felt like a small, shy animal approaching a sleeping giant. The house itself wasn't just a house. It was a cliff face of stone and glass, with windows like 100 unblinking eyes, all lit up from within. Music and laughter, bright and sharp, spilled out into the cool night air. 14-year-old Lara sat in the back seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She could feel the simple blue cotton of her dress, hand-me-down that had been mended and washed so many times the fabric was soft as a cloud. Here, among the sleek, dark cars that gleamed under the lanterns lining the drive, her dress felt like a badge that announced she didn't belong. When the driver opened her door, the wall of sound hit her fully. It wasn't just music. It was a wave of human voices, the clinking of ice in glasses. A high peal of laughter that sounded like breaking glass. Taking a breath that felt too thin for her lungs, she stepped out. The air itself felt different here. It was scented with expensive perfume, the smell of grilling meat from somewhere unseen, and the sweet, heavy fragrance of 100 roses blooming in manicured gardens. It was a world of abundance, and she felt like a trespasser. The woman from the orphanage, Mrs. Gable, gave her a small, encouraging smile before being guided toward a side entrance for the staff and volunteers. Lara was alone. Her official invitation, the one that had arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope, said she was to enter through the main doors. A man in a sharp black suit stood there, his face unreadable. He didn't smile. He simply looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her simple dress and scuffed shoes for a fraction of a second too long. He said nothing, only gave a slight nod of his head, a gesture that felt less like an invitation and more like a verdict. Stepping inside was like walking into a different dimension. The floor was a swirled pattern of marble that was so polished it reflected the crystal chandeliers, hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The light from them fractured into a million tiny rainbows that danced on the walls and on the crowd of people below. The people were all shining too. The men in dark suits, the women in dresses that shimmered like the surface of a lake at sunset. It was a sea of silk and velvet and jewels, all moving and talking and laughing in a low, confident rumble. Lara felt instantly invisible, and yet painfully visible at the same time. No one looked directly at her, but she could feel their awareness, a sense of a small, dull stone in a room full of glittering gems. She clutched the small, folded piece of paper in her hand, her verification that she was supposed to be here, that she was a special guest. The words felt like a lie. She was a curiosity. She had won a citywide music competition for students who couldn't afford private lessons. And the grand prize was this: to perform one song at the annual charity gala of the richest man in the city. Alistair Finch. She scanned the room, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't looking for the bar or the buffet tables. She was looking for the piano. The invitation had mentioned it. Finch had recently acquired a legendary Steinway, a concert grand that was said to have a voice like an angel. That was why she was here, to play this piano, and then she saw it. It sat on a slightly raised platform at the far end of the ballroom, like a throne. It wasn't just black. It was a deep, shimmering ebony, its polished lid reflecting the entire glittering room in a distorted funhouse way. It was perfect. Every curve, every line was flawless. It looked less like an instrument and more like a piece of abstract art, a monument to wealth and taste. A velvet rope was stanchioned around it, keeping the guests at a distance, as if it were a religious relic they could only look at, not touch. A cold knot of dread formed in Lara's stomach. This was not her piano. Her piano was an old, upright behemoth that lived in the dusty corner of the orphanage's common room. Its wood was scuffed and stained from 100 different spills. Some of the ivories were yellowed and chipped, and a few of them stuck if you didn't press them just right. But it had a soul. It was where she went when the world felt too loud. It was where she poured out the feelings she could never speak aloud, the loneliness of not having parents, the quiet frustration of being just one child among dozens, the flicker of hope that maybe, someday, Her music could take her somewhere else. This piano in front of her, this perfect, gleaming Steinway, looked cold. It looked like it would judge her. It had no stickers on its keys from a child's hand, no faint coffee rings on its surface. It was immaculate and intimidating. She began to walk toward it, and it felt like the longest journey of her life. She moved through the crowd, a ghost in their world. She tried to make herself small, to hug the walls, but her path was inevitable. As she got closer, she noticed a group of men gathered near the platform, all listening to one man who was speaking with his back to her. He had a loud, confident voice that cut easily through the party's noise, even before he turned. She knew it was Alistair Finch. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, and he held a glass of something amber in his hand as he gestured. He was telling a story, and his listeners were hanging on his every word, their laughter punctuating his sentences. Lara hesitated a few feet away. She didn't want to interrupt. She just wanted to wait quietly until it was her turn. But her presence, a quiet, still figure in the chaos, did not go unnoticed. Alistair Finch finished his story, and his audience roared with laughter. He took a small, satisfied bow of his head, and then, as he was turning to get another drink, his eyes landed on her. He stopped. A slow, calculating look moved across her face, from her plain shoes, up her simple dress, to her nervous, wide eyes. A smirk, the kind that doesn't involve the eyes at all, touched the corner of his mouth. He saw an opportunity for a new kind of performance, one for his personal audience. Well, he boomed, his voice suddenly much louder, assuring that everyone in his circle would hear. He gestured toward her with his glass. "Speak of the devil, and she shall appear. Gentlemen, may I present our evening's little charity case?" A few of the men chuckled, their eyes turning to appraise her. Lara's face began to burn. Finch took a step closer, looming over her. "Come to give our new investment a test run, have we?" He looked at the piano and then back at her, his smirk widening. "Be careful now, dear. That finish is worth more than your entire orphanage. Don't smudge it." The men around him burst into loud, genuine laughter. It was a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in Lara's ears. She felt their eyes on her, a mix of pity, amusement, contempt. She wanted the floor to crack open and swallow her whole. Her hands, which had been so capable and strong on her old familiar piano, felt useless and small. She could feel them starting to tremble. She looked from Alistair Finch's cruel, smiling face to the cold, black surface of the piano. It felt like they were on the same team and she was the enemy. The laughter of the men swelled, bouncing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, a sound that was bigger and more powerful than she was. She was just a girl in a hand-me-down dress, a mockable object in a room full of beautiful, valuable things. For a long, terrible moment, the world was just the sound of their laughter and the cold, silent promise of the keys in front of her. Asterisk, the sound of the men's laughter didn't just stop. It seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, like cigar smoke, curling around the crystal chandeliers and clinging to the marble walls. Even after Alistair Finch and his friends had turned away, their laughter echoed in Lara's mind, a vicious loop that played over and over. They had already forgotten her, their attention shifting to the arrival of a new guest, a woman draped in diamonds who was greeted with far more warmth than she had been. To them, she was a momentary distraction, a cheap joke that had served its purpose. She was now just a piece of furniture, standing awkwardly by a far more valuable piece of furniture. Asterisk, her feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. The urge to run was a physical force, pulling at her legs, telling her to turn, to push her way through the silken velvet, to burst out the heavy front doors and breathe in the cold, clean night air until her lungs stopped aching. She could go back to the car, back to the orphanage, back to the dusty common room where the piano didn't judge her, back where she belonged. The shame was a hot, prickling cloak she couldn't take off. She could still feel Finch's eyes on her, that dismissive, mocking stare that had measured her worth and found it to be less than the polish on a piano lid. She looked down at her hands. They were still trembling. They were the hands of a girl who washed dishes, who mended her own clothes. who knew the texture of worn-out second-hand books. They were not the hands of a musician who belonged on a stage like this. The platform with the piano felt like a cage, and the velvet rope around it was the bars. She was an exhibit on display, the orphan girl. See her in her natural habitat of public humiliation. Every face in the room seemed to be a mask of condescension, even though most of them weren't even looking at her anymore. The very air of the place, scented with wealth and indifference, felt hostile. It was telling her to leave. She took a half-step back, her eyes scanning the room for an escape route. And that's when she saw her, standing near the far wall, almost blending into the shadows, was Mrs. Gable. The matron wasn't allowed in the main party area, but she had clearly found a spot where she could watch from a distance. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her usual stern expression softened by a look of intense focus. When their eyes met across the crowded room, Lara expected to see pity. She expected to see an apology for having brought her to this place, but she saw none of that instead. Mrs. Gable's gaze was steady and clear. It was a look that held no pity, but held something much stronger. It held belief. It was the same look she gave Lara when she was struggling with a difficult piece of music on the old upright. A look that said, "You already know how to do this. You just have to trust yourself." Then Mrs. Gable did the smallest thing. She gave one almost imperceptible nod of her head. In that single nod, whole conversation passed between them, a silent promise that had nothing to do with words. It was an understanding that this room, with all its noise and its cold shine, didn't matter. It was a reminder of the countless hours in the dimly lit common room. The smell of old books and floor wax, the feel of the worn wooden keys under her fingers. It was a reminder that the music was not something that happened in a beautiful room for rich people. The music was hers. The shame that had been weighing her down began to lift, just a little. The laughter in her head grew quieter. She looked back at the piano, at its perfect, gleaming black surface. She started to see it differently. It wasn't a judge. It wasn't a trophy. It was just wood and wire and strings. It was a tool. The soul didn't come from the piano. The soul came from the person who played it. The music wasn't in this room. It was inside her, a place Finch and his friends could never touch. A strange, quiet calm began to settle over her. She thought of the old upright piano back home. She thought of the C-sharp key that stuck if you didn't press it firmly. The funny buzzing sound the middle B string made. The faded watermark on the side from where someone had spilled a glass of water years before she was even born. Those weren't flaws. They were stories. That piano had lived a life just like she had. This Steinway was a pristine, perfect stranger, but it still spoke the same language. It just needed someone to translate for it. The noise of the party began to fade into a dull, meaningless hum. The shimmering dresses, the polished shoes, the flashing jewelry had all lost its power to intimidate. It was just a backdrop, a colorful but irrelevant scenery for the real story. The real story was the quiet conversation that was about to happen between her and the 98 keys in front of her. She made her decision. She was not going to run. Moving slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward and unhooked the velvet rope from its stanchion. The soft clink of the metal clip felt like a declaration. She carefully draped the rope over the post, a quiet gesture that said, "This is my space now." The smooth, heavy bench was waiting. She pulled it out from the piano, the soft scrape of its wooden legs against the platform the only sound she made. Then she sat. The moment she sat down, her entire posture changed. Her back, which had been curved with shame and fear, straightened. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, relaxed and fell. She settled onto the bench, a space she had occupied 1,000 times before, and suddenly she was home. The grand, intimidating ballroom, with its 100 judgmental eyes, seemed to melt away. All that was left was her, the bench, and the keyboard. She rested her fingers on the keys. They were cool and smooth, perfect and even, unlike the chipped and yellowed ivories she was used to. But the weight of them, the potential they held, felt the same. The crowd was oblivious. A waiter drifted past with a tray of glasses. A group of women laughed loudly nearby. Alistair Finch was deep in a story again, his voice a confident boom. No one was waiting. No one was expecting anything. This was the best gift they could have given her, their indifference. She had no sheet music with her. She never used it. Her music came from a place that had no notes, a place of feelings and memories. She closed her eyes, shutting out the crystal chandeliers and the silken gowns. She shut out the memory of Finch's cruel smile. She took one slow, deep breath, filling her lungs with air that smelled of faint perfume and old wood. And then, in the quiet, unwatched space she had carved for herself, she began. Her first touch on the keys was not gentle. It was not the soft, exploratory note everyone expected from a small, nervous girl. Her fingers, now steady and sure, pressed down on several keys at once. The sound that erupted from the perfect Steinway was not a simple melody. It was a complex, layered chord, thick with emotion. It was dissonant, a sound that seemed to argue with itself, filled with a deep, resonant ache that was almost ugly in its honesty. It was the sound of a question asked in a dark room with no hope of an answer. That single, hanging sound did something no laughter could do. It sliced through the low, confident rumble of the party. Conversation stuttered and died. The clinking of ice and glasses stopped. A woman's high, bright laugh was cut off mid-chime. It was as if a ghost had walked into the room and spoken their true name. The chord held in the air, vibrating in the high ceiling, demanding to be felt. It was a sound that didn't belong in this glittering, superficial world. It belonged in an old, empty church or on a windswept cliff. It was the sound of profound sorrow. From that first shocking declaration, her hands began to move. There was no sheet music to follow, no well-known classical piece to recognize. This was a story being told for the first time, a story that was entirely her own. Her right hand began to shape a melody that was both fragile and determined. It moved slowly at first, like a person searching for a path in a dense fog. It was a lonely sound, a sound that spoke of small, quiet rooms and long, empty afternoons. It was the sound of a girl looking out a window at a world she was not a part of. It was the sound of her own life. Then her left hand joined in, not with a simple harmony, but with a low, rolling series of notes that felt like a gathering storm. The lonely melody from her right hand was now fighting against something, pushing against a heavy, oppressive weight. The music grew in intensity. Her fingers, which had seemed so small and weak just moments before, now flew across the keys with a strength that seemed impossible. The notes were no longer just sad, they were angry. The chords were sharp and harsh, crashing against each other like waves in a storm. It was the sound of frustration, the sound of a scream held back for too long. It was the sound of being powerless, of being mocked and dismissed, of being treated like an object of pity. Anyone in that room who had ever felt small or unheard felt that sound in their bones. Alistair Finch was in the middle of a story about a hostile takeover, his voice laced with self-satisfaction. When that first chord hit, his words had faltered for a second. He had been about to brush it off, to make a remark about the orphan girl finally finding the wrong note. But as the music continued, his voice caught in his throat completely. He found himself turning, along with everyone else, his back to his guests, his full attention captured by the sound. The smirk was gone from his face. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He was no longer hearing a performance. He was hearing a confession. The music was stripping away everything. It was stripping away the polished floor, the chandeliers, the expensive clothes, the layers of politeness and social maneuvering. It was stripping away his own name and reputation. All that was left was raw, vulnerable, human emotion. And it was coming from the very girl he had just tried to crush, the angry. Crashing part of the music reached its peak. A thunderous roar of sound that filled the entire ballroom. It felt like the world was ending. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. Her right hand, which had been fighting so hard, found a new path. A single, high, clear note pierced through the complex, heavy chords from her left hand. It was a tiny sound, but it was impossibly pure. It was a sound of hope. It was the sound of a single candle being lit in a vast, dark room. From that one note, a new melody began to grow. It was tentative at first, but it was strong. It was not a melody of defeat, but of resilience. It was the sound of getting up after being pushed down. It was the sound of finding your voice when you thought you had been silenced. The complex chords from her left hand began to soften, to change. They were no longer fighting the melody. They were supporting it, lifting it up, giving it a foundation to stand on. The music was now a conversation. The melody, representing the small, fragile hope, and the harmony, representing the weight of the world, were no longer at war. They were working together. The sound was no longer just sorrowful or angry. It was deeply, powerfully beautiful. It was the sound of survival. People in the crowd stood frozen, glasses forgotten in their hands. A woman in a diamond necklace felt a single tear slide down her cheek. A tear for a loneliness she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 20 years. A stern-faced old man, a rival of Finch's, felt his chest tighten with a memory of his own father telling him his dreams were foolish. They were all seeing something in this girl's music that they had seen in themselves, a truth they had long ago learned to hide. She was playing their secret hurts, their buried ambitions, their quiet griefs. Lara's eyes were still closed. She was no longer in the ballroom. She was back in the common room at the orphanage. Her fingers on the sticky keys of the old upright, telling the piano about her day. She was telling it about the feeling of Finch's words, the heat in her cheeks, the tremble in her hands. But she was also telling it about Mrs. Gable's steady gaze, about the feeling of her own back straightening, about the quiet decision to stay. The music was her own heart, laid bare for everyone to hear. The peace began to build again. But this time, it wasn't a storm of anger. It was a crescendo of triumph. The melody grew stronger, soaring higher. The harmony became richer, more complex and full. It was a sound of immense power, but it was a power that came not from dominance, but from overcoming. It was the sound of a spirit that could not be broken. Finch stared, utterly mesmerized. He felt a strange, painful sensation in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. It was a feeling of regret. A memory, long suppressed, pushed its way to the surface of his mind. Himself as a boy, barely older than Lara, sitting at a beautiful piano just like this one, his own hands filled with the music he loved. He remembered his own father, a man just as rich and powerful as Finch was now, standing over him. Music is a hobby for the weak, Alistair. We deal in facts and figures, not feelings. Stop this foolishness. He remembered the feeling of his own music being mocked, the shame he felt, and the final, crushing decision to lock that part of himself away forever. He had built his entire life, his empire, on top of that buried passion. And here was this girl, this orphan, this nobody, playing that very music with a courage he had never possessed. She was playing his lost soul. It was the most beautiful and painful thing he had ever heard. The music reached its final, majestic peak. It was a sound that was both heartbreakingly sad and wildly joyful, a perfect, impossible paradox. And then, with the confident precision of a master storyteller reaching the end of her tale, her hands came down on the keys for the last time. It was not a soft, fading end. It was a final, decisive chord that was both powerful and complete. It was the sound of a door closing on one chapter of a life and the certainty of a new one beginning. Her fingers rested on the keys as the final note vibrated into silence, and in that silence, the world had changed forever. Asterisk, the final chord did not just stop. It seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving behind a space that felt deeper and more profound than the room had been before. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, living silence. Silence that was so full of the story they had just heard that any other sound would have felt like a violation. It was the kind of quiet that falls in a forest after a thunderstorm has passed. When the air is clean and the world feels reborn, for a long moment no one moved. Waiters stood frozen with trays of half-filled glasses. People in the middle of a step remained motionless on the dance floor. 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on the small figure sitting at the piano. The faces that had been masks of polite boredom or amused condescension were now open, raw, and utterly captivated. It was as if Lara's music had peeled back the layers of their lives, revealing the quiet, hidden parts of themselves they kept locked away. They were not looking at an orphan girl anymore. They were looking into a mirror that reflected their own deepest sorrows and their most secret hopes. Lara's shoulders were still straight, but the tension was gone, replaced by a soft, quiet weariness. Her hands rested on the keys, her fingers still pressed into the ivory as if to hold on to the last echoes of the sound. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The world came back into focus. The glittering chandeliers, the sea of strange faces, the marble floors, but it all looked different. The judgment was gone. The hostility was gone. In its place was something she had never expected to see directed at her. Awe. She felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was Mrs. Gable, who had somehow made her way through the crowd and onto the platform. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were shining with a pride so fierce it felt like a shield. Without a word, Mrs. Gable wrapped her arms around the girl, pulling her into a hug that was warm and solid and real. It was a hug that said, "I knew it. I always knew." Lara leaned into it, letting the matron's strength support her own. For the first time that evening, she felt like a child again, safe and protected. Then a sound broke the sacred silence. It was the soft clap of a single pair of hands. Everyone turned to see an elderly woman with snow-white hair, dressed in a simple but elegant black suit. She was standing near the front, her hands pressed together in front of her chest, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. She was not applauding the performance. She was acknowledging the truth. Her quiet clap was like a match lit in a dark room. Another person joined in, then another and another. The sound grew, not into a polite patter, but into a groundswell of emotion. It was a release, an outpouring of feeling that had been building in every person in the room. Soon, the entire ballroom was on its feet. The applause was thunderous, a roar of heartfelt appreciation that shook the very foundations of the gilded hall. It was not the applause for a musician who had played all the right notes. It was the applause for a human being who had been brave enough to play her soul. Through the noise, Alistair Finch stood utterly still. The sound of the applause was a physical force against him, a wall of sound that was both beautiful and torturous. He looked at his guests, their faces alight with a passion he had never seen in them before. He looked at the girl, now wrapped in a simple, honest hug from the plain-looking woman from the orphanage. He saw the stark, unembellished truth of their connection. And then he looked at the empty, hollow connections in his own room. People were laughing with him, but no one was hugging him. They were celebrating his wealth, but they were celebrating her spirit. He felt a cold shame creep up his neck, a feeling so unfamiliar it was like a foreign substance in his blood. His mind raced back through his life, a highlight reel of achievements and acquisitions. He had bought companies, built towers, collected art, and surrounded himself with people who admired his power. He had measured his worth in numbers, in stock prices, in the size of his house, the rarity of his wine. He had thought that was value. He had just stood in front of a piano that was worth a small fortune and mocked the girl who was about to play it. He had tried to quantify her, to diminish her, to put her in her place, and in 3 minutes, without saying a single word, she had shown him that everything he prized was worthless. His piano had no voice until she gave it one. His house had no heart until she filled it with her story. His life, for all its success, felt suddenly, unbearably empty. The applause began to subside as people started to talk to each other in excited, emotional whispers. They were trying to put into words what they had just felt. But Finch didn't need to talk. He knew exactly what he had to do. He started walking. His steps were sure, cutting through the small groups of people who parted for him without knowing why. He wasn't walking toward his business partners or his socialite friends. He was walking directly toward the stage. As he approached, Mrs. Gable let go of Lara and turned to face him, her expression shifting from pride to a fierce protectiveness. She stood between the billionaire and the girl, a silent guardian. Lara looked up, her eyes wide again, but this time not with fear, but with a quiet, steady curiosity. She saw the man who had mocked her, the owner of this overwhelming house, walking toward her with a strange, unreadable expression on his face. Finch climbed the 3 small steps onto the platform. The space, which had seemed so vast when she was alone, now felt small and intimate. He ignored Mrs. Gable for a moment, his focus entirely on the girl. He looked not at her clothes or her status, but at her eyes, at the young, old soul that had just poured itself out for everyone to hear. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words that usually came so easily to him felt clumsy and wrong. He had spent his life using words to command, to negotiate, to impress. None of those words would work here. He had to find new ones. He took a breath and let the simple, honest truth come out. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was quiet, almost rough, with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to show in public for decades. "What I said earlier. It was unforgivable. I had no idea." The words hung in the air between them. They were not the words of a powerful man making a strategic apology. They were the words of a man humbled. He didn't make excuses. He didn't explain. He simply stated the truth of his mistake. Lara looked at him, searching his face. She saw the smirk was gone. She saw the arrogance had vanished. In its place was a vulnerability that was startling. It was the same raw emotion she had put into her music, now reflected back at her from the man who had tried to silence it. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of her own. In acceptance, Finch felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even known was there. He turned his attention to Mrs. Gable, his expression softening further. "And you, madam," he said, his voice full of respect. "You are a guardian of a true treasure." Mrs. Gable's posture relaxed, just a fraction. She gave a curt, dignified nod. "She is her own treasure, sir. I have merely had the honor of watching her grow." He then looked back at Lara, and a new thought came to him, one that was so clear and right it felt like a discovery. He could offer her a recording contract. He could offer her a full scholarship to the most expensive music school in the world. He could offer her fame and fortune. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that every one of those offers would be an insult. It would be him, Alistair Finch, trying to buy her spirit, trying to put a price on the thing she had just shown to be priceless. Instead, he took a different path, a humbler path. "That piano in my front hall," he said, his gaze drifting for a second to the gleaming Steinway before coming back to her, "is just a piece of furniture. It has no value. The music in you, that is the most valuable thing in this house. I would like to help you nurture it, if you would let me. Not as a patron, but as a student." The words hung in the air, stranger and more surprising than any apology. Alistair Finch, the king of acquisition, was asking to be a student. Lara's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "A student?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Finch nodded, a genuine, almost shy smile touching his lips for the first time. "My father made me abandon my own studies when I was a boy. He said music was for the weak. You have just shown me how wrong he was. I don't want to buy your music. I want to learn what it means to feel it again, perhaps. Perhaps I could pay for the best teachers for you, and I could sit in the back of the room and listen." The offer was so unexpected, so profoundly personal, that it silenced the last of the noise in Lara's head. It wasn't about her being a charity case. It was about a shared connection, a recognition of the power of the music itself. She looked at this powerful, broken man, and then she looked past him, her mind suddenly somewhere else. The thought of her own future, her own teachers, was important. But another thought, a bigger one, had taken its place. She thought of the dusty common room, of the old upright with its sticking keys and its buzzing strings. She thought of the other children, some younger than her, who sat on the floor and listened to her play, their faces filled with the same longing and wonder she felt. She thought of one little boy in particular, a quiet boy named Leo, who was always sketching in a notebook, but never showed anyone his drawings, who would hum his own little melodies under his breath. Her voice, though still soft, was clear and steady when she spoke. "The children at the orphanage," she said, her eyes meeting Finch's directly. "Our piano's very old." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a complaint. It was a simple statement of fact, offered as part of the conversation. But in its simplicity, it was the most powerful thing she could have said. She was not just thinking of herself. She was thinking of the other quiet souls in the world who needed a voice. Alistair Finch stared at her. He had come to this stage to offer her the world, and in response, she had offered him a lesson in humanity. He felt a smile spread across his face, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. Like the boy he had once been before he had learned to build walls around his heart. "Of course," he said, "of course. It's the least we can do." But in his mind, he was already thinking it was the most he could do. It wasn't the least. It was everything. It was a beginning. The last of the applause had faded. The guests were starting to drift away. Their conversations now filled with the story of the girl at the piano. But on that small, illuminated stage, a completely different story was just beginning. A story not about a millionaire mocking an orphan, but about a man who was finally learning the true meaning of value, and a girl who was teaching it to him. The story of that night did not end with a grand finale or a public announcement. The headlines the next morning were about the gala's fundraising totals, not about the girl who had played the piano. In a world that moved so quickly from one spectacle to the next, Laura's performance was a beautiful, fleeting moment that was already becoming a hazy, cherished memory for those who were there. For Alistair Finch, however, it was not a memory. It was a new beginning, a quiet, profound shift in the architecture of his life. The very next morning, long before the city was awake, he made a call. It wasn't to a business associate or a stockbroker. It was to the most prestigious piano house in the country. He didn't just order a piano. He spoke with the owner, a man he knew socially, and for the first time, he didn't talk about price or brand name. He talked about sound. He described the old upright at the orphanage, its flaws and its history. He described the feeling of a room full of children who needed to feel something bigger than their four walls. He didn't want the most expensive piano they had. He wanted the one with the warmest, most welcoming soul. 2 days later, a truck arrived at the orphanage. It wasn't a flashy delivery, and no one from the press was there. The movers were quiet and respectful as they carefully brought a beautiful, new grand piano through the front door and into the common room. It was not as intimidatingly perfect as the Steinway at the mansion. It had a warmer, darker wood, a softer sheen. It looked like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for this room all along. The children, who had been told only that a special gift was arriving, gathered in the doorway, their eyes wide with a wonder that was completely silent. The real gift arrived with the piano. A week later, a new woman showed up at the orphanage. Her name was Elspeth, a retired music teacher with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and a kind, patient smile. She was not an employee of Finch's corporation. She was a friend he had hired personally. Her job was not to prodigy hunt, but simply to teach any child who wanted to learn. To open the door for them the way Lara's music had opened a door for Finch. The first lesson she gave was not to Lara, but to a shy 6-year-old who wanted to learn Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Lara's life changed in a more subtle way. A trust fund was quietly set up in her name, enough to ensure she would never have to worry about her education or her future. But there were no cameras, no press releases. Finch made it clear to Mrs. Gable that the girl's privacy was paramount. The world did not need to own her story. Her music was for her and for anyone who needed to hear it. The offer to be his student was also honored, but not in the way one might expect. Finch did not take lessons himself. Instead, Elspeth would send him weekly recordings of her students' progress fumbling scales. Simple melodies, hesitant chords. He would listen in his office late at night, the city lights twinkling below him. And he would hear not just the notes, but the stories. He was learning, just as he had promised. A few months passed. The seasons changed, and the orphanage settled into a new rhythm, one that now included the gentle, constant presence of music. The common room, once a place for waiting, had become a place for creating. The old, worn piano was moved to a corner, a beloved relic of the past, while the new one became the heart of the home. One Tuesday afternoon, the sun was slanting through the tall windows of the common room, dust motes dancing in the golden light. The room smelled of old books, chalk dust from a nearby classroom, and the faint, sweet scent of wood polish. A group of younger children were spread out on the worn rug, some drawing, some looking at picture books. The usual quiet hum of activity was in the air. Lara sat at the new piano. But she was not playing a grand emotional piece for an audience. She was sitting next to a little boy, Leo, who was the same boy she had thought of on the stage that night. Leo was 7 years old and was so quiet he was almost invisible. He never spoke in groups and always kept his head down, but he watched everything. He had a sketchbook filled with fantastical drawings of birds with too many wings and houses that floated on clouds today. His sketchbook was lying on the rug, forgotten. He was sitting on the piano bench, his small body rigid with concentration. His right hand was hovering over the keys, his index finger poised above a single note. His face was a mask of intense focus, his brow furrowed, his bottom lip caught between his teeth. He had been trying to play this one note for 5 minutes. His fear of making a wrong sound paralyzing him. Lara was not rushing him. She was just a calm, solid presence beside him. She wasn't looking at him with pressure, but with a gentle patience that said, "It's okay. There is no wrong sound here. Just let your finger fall," she said softly, her voice a low murmur. "Like a leaf dropping from a tree? It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be." Leo took a shaky breath. He squeezed his eyes shut and let his finger drop. A clear, single C note rang out in the quiet room. It wasn't perfect. It was a little hesitant, a little weak, but it was his. A small, amazed smile spread across Leo's face. He opened his eyes and looked at his own finger, as if it belonged to someone else. Then he looked at Lara, his eyes shining with a light that no one had ever seen in them before. Lara smiled back. A real, warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "See?" she said. "You did it." She then gently placed her own hand on the keys. She played the same note, but this time she let it resonate, and then she played another note, and another, weaving them into a simple, sweet melody. It wasn't complex or sad or angry. It was a simple, happy little tune, like a conversation between two friends. She played it once, and then she looked at Leo. She lifted her hand and gestured for him to try. This time, his hesitation was gone. He pressed his finger down, and Lara played the notes that answered his. Back and forth they went, the shy boy and the girl who had played for a king. Their notes a simple duet in the sunny afternoon. The other children on the rug looked up, their faces drawn to the sound. The music was not a performance. It was a shared moment, a thread of connection woven between them. Standing in the doorway of the common room, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, was Alistair Finch. He had come by unannounced, a habit he had developed over the past few months. He never came with an entourage or a check. He came alone, just to stand and listen. He saw the scene on the piano bench, the little boy's tentative finger finding its voice. The girl's patient encouragement, their simple, beautiful duet. He watched as the other children on the rug, drawn by the music, began to drift closer. Gathering around the piano like baby birds around a source of warmth, one little girl rested her head on Lara's knee, her eyes closing as she listened. Leo, now brimming with confidence, was trying to pick out the melody with his own 2 small hands, his laughter tinkling through the quiet notes. Whenever he made a mistake, Finch felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He thought back to the man he had been that night at the Gallararrogant Hollow, so desperate to prove his own worth that he had to mock a child to feel big. That man felt like a stranger to him now, a ghost from another life. He had spent his entire life trying to fill the empty spaces inside him with things, with accomplishments, with the admiration of people who didn't really know him. He had built a palace of glass and steel, but it had been a cold, empty place. This room, this dusty, humble, common room, was a palace of a different kind. Its richness wasn't in the polish on the floor or the newness of the piano. It was in the shy smile on a boy's face. It was in the patient trust in a girl's eyes. It was in the shared, quiet language of music that was bringing them all together. This was the real value. This was the thing that could never be bought or sold. It could only be given and received. He had come to that gala thinking he was the one with all the power, but the girl at the piano had been the powerful one. She had a power that didn't come from money or status. It came from courage, from vulnerability, from a willingness to share her true self with the world. And in doing so, she had given him a gift far greater than any he could ever purchase. She had given him back a piece of his own soul. He watched for a few more moments, committing the scene to memory. He didn't need to be seen. His presence here wasn't for them. It was for him. It was a reminder of what was real. He turned and walked quietly back down the hall, the sound of the simple, joyful duet following him like a benediction. The story of the millionaire and the orphan. Girl was not a story about a girl who became a star. It was a story about a girl who, by simply being herself, changed the world for one man. And that man, in turn, changed the world for a small group of children. And those children, with their simple, brave music, were now changing the world for each other. It was a quiet story, a simple story, but it was a true one. And its echo was a song that would play on long after the last note had faded.